The blood in the snow wasn't what stopped Cordell Brightwater in his tracks. It was the way the horse lifted its head and looked directly into his soul, as if it had been waiting 43 years for this exact moment. Steam rose from the animal's nostrils in the bitter February air, each breath a desperate cloud against the Wyoming wilderness. The chestnut mare stood three-legged in the middle of nowhere, her right foreleg bent at an unnatural angle, yet her dark eyes held not pain, but recognition. Cordell had been checking his fence line when he spotted her, a splash of russet against the pristine white that had fallen during the night's blizzard. "Easy there, girl," he murmured, approaching slowly with his hands visible. His weathered fingers, callous from decades of ranch work, trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from something he couldn't name. The horse didn't shy away. Instead, she nickered softly, a sound that sent an inexplicable chill down his spine. Cordell knelt beside her injured leg, his experienced eyes assessing the damage. A clean break, but not fresh. This mare had been traveling for days, maybe weeks, pushing through pain that would have felled lesser animals. Her coat, beneath the ice crystals and mud, showed signs of good care. Someone had loved this horse. Once, her hooves were well maintained, her mane recently brushed despite the tangles from her journey. "Where'd you come from, beautiful?" he whispered, running his hand along her neck. Beneath his palm, he felt a small, raised scar, a brand, but unlike any he'd seen in these parts. The mark was intricate, almost artistic, intertwining letters that formed something between a monogram and a symbol. As he traced the brand with his finger, memories stirred like sediment in a disturbed pond. His childhood home, 300 miles east, had burned when he was 16, his father's prize breeding stock. The family legacy spanning for generations had been lost in a single night of flames and chaos. Cordell had salvaged what he could and started over here in the shadow of the Tetons, building a modest spread that kept him fed but never quite filled the hole that disaster had carved in his heart. The mare shifted her weight, pressing against his shoulder with surprising gentleness. When he looked up, she was staring east, toward the rising sun, toward the direction from which she'd come. Her ears pricked forward with unmistakable intent. "You want to go somewhere, don't you?" Cordell said, understanding flooding through him. This wasn't a lost horse, this was a horse with a mission. "But first, let's get that leg looked at." He fashioned a makeshift splint from fence boards and baling wire, working with the patience of a man who'd doctored countless animals. Over the years, the mare stood perfectly still, as if she understood that healing was necessary before whatever journey lay ahead could continue. As he worked, Cordell found himself telling her about his past, words spilling out that he'd never spoken aloud. About the night the fire took everything, about the insurance money that had never quite covered the loss, about the dreams he still had of horses he'd never see again, bloodlines that had vanished in smoke and flame. The mare listened with the intensity of a priest hearing confession, her dark eyes never leaving his face. When he finished wrapping her leg, she took a tentative step forward, testing her weight. Then she turned toward him and, impossibly, bowed her head, a gesture so deliberate, so human in its gratitude, that Cordell felt tears freeze on his cheeks. "Well then," he said, his voice thick with emotion he didn't understand, "I reckon we'd better see where you're trying to take me." 3 days later, Cordell found himself further from his ranch than he'd been in 20 years, riding his own gelding while leading the injured mare on a rope. She had refused to be loaded into his trailer, dancing away with surprising agility for an animal with a broken leg, whenever he'd approached with the lead rope near the ramp. But when he'd saddled up Dusty and mounted, she'd fallen into step beside them without hesitation, her makeshift splint holding as she maintained a steady three-leg gait. The mare he'd taken to calling her quest, though he wasn't sure why, seemed to navigate by instinct rather than sight. When they reached crossroads, she would turn her head decisively in one direction, never wavering, never second-guessing. Cordell had given up trying to understand how she knew where they were going. He simply followed, camping under the stars and sharing his provisions with his unexpected guide. On the morning of the 4th day, they crested a hill that looked down into a valley Cordell recognized with a jolt that nearly unseated him. The Sweetwater River curved through grassland exactly as it had in his boyhood memories, though everything else had changed. Where once his family's ranch had sprawled across 3,000 acres, now he saw subdivision after subdivision. Neat rows of houses with manicured lawns and vinyl fencing. Quest whinnied sharply, the sound cutting through the morning air like a blade. Her entire body trembled with excitement, or perhaps sorrow. Cordell couldn't tell which. She pulled against the lead rope, trying to hurry down the slope despite her injury. "Ho there, girl," he said, but his own heart was racing. This was home, or what used to be home. Before the fire, before the bankruptcy, before his father had sold the land to developers and died broken-hearted 6 months later, they made their way through streets that bore names Cordell didn't recognize: Meadowlark Lane, Sagebrush Circle, Prairie Wind Way. The irony wasn't lost on him. The developers had named their suburban paradise after the very wilderness they'd paved over. But Quest moved through the maze of identical houses with confidence, turning left at a playground, right at a small shopping center, left again at a street lined with Bradford pear trees. Finally, she stopped in front of a house that looked no different from its neighbor's beige siding. Brown shutters, a 2-car garage, and a yard dominated by Kentucky bluegrass that had never seen a buffalo or felt the wind without first passing through a sprinkler system. But Quest was trembling again, her nostrils flared, her eyes fixed on something Cordell couldn't see. An elderly woman emerged from the front door, moving slowly with the aid of a walker. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a cardigan despite the warming morning. When she saw them, she stopped so suddenly that her walker scraped against the concrete. "Misty," she whispered, the name carrying across the small yard like a prayer. Quester Misty whinnied again, a sound full of longing and joy and heartbreak all mixed together. The woman began to cry, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she made her way toward the fence that separated her yard from the street. "Misty, baby, is that really you?" she called, her voice shaking. "Oh, my sweet girl, I thought I'd never see you again." Cordell dismounted, his mind reeling. "Ma'am, I found this horse up in Wyoming, injured and alone. She led me here, but I don't understand." 63 years, the woman said, reaching through the fence to touch Misty's muzzle. "I've been waiting 63 years for you to come home." The pieces of an impossible puzzle began clicking into place in Cordell's mind. The brand he'd seen on Misty's neck, the way she'd known to travel east, the recognition in her eyes when she'd first seen him. But horses didn't live 63 years. It was impossible, unless it wasn't. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "what did you say your name was?" "Ophelia Brightwater," she replied, still focused on the horse. "Well, it's Ophelia Crane now. Has been for 40 years since I remarried. But I was born a Brightwater right here on this land when it was still a ranch." Cordell's world tilted on its axis. "Brightwater Ranch? Yes," she said, finally looking at him. "My family raised horses here for generations until the fire in 1981. Lost everything: the house, the barns, most of the breeding stock. The insurance barely covered the debts. Daddy had to sell to developers." She paused, studying his face with growing recognition. "You look familiar, son. What did you say your name was?" "Cordell Brightwater," he said quietly. "I think you might be my aunt." The coffee in Ophelia's kitchen tasted like forgiveness, though Cordell couldn't explain why that thought had crossed his mind. He sat at her small dining table, still wearing his travel-stained clothes, watching his aunt move carefully round her modest kitchen while Misty grazed in the backyard. A sight that should have been impossible but felt completely natural. "Your father was my baby brother," Ophelia said, setting down a plate of homemade cookies that smelled like his childhood. "Marcus was 10 years younger than me, born when I was already thinking about marriage and moving away. I was 26 when the fire happened, newlywed to my first husband, living in Denver. By the time I got back to help with the aftermath, you and Marcus had already left for Wyoming." Cordell wrapped his hands around the warm mug, seeking comfort in its heat. Dad never mentioned he had a sister. After the fire, he never talked about much of anything from before. "Grief does that to people," Ophelia said softly. Makes them want to bury the past so deep it can't hurt them anymore. But some things refuse to stay buried. She glanced toward the window where Misty stood, impossibly alive, impossibly here. Especially the things we love most. Ophelia, Cordell said, the title feeling strange on his tongue. Horses don't live 63 years. It's not possible. She smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face into something younger, more mysterious. You sound just like your grandfather used to, practical, logical, feet firmly planted on the ground. But this family has always had a different relationship with horses than most folks. Your great-great-grandfather, Silas Brightwater, he claimed our bloodlines were touched by something special. What kind of special? Ophelia settled into the chair across from him, her movements careful but her eyes bright with memory. The horses we bred, they were different, smarter, more loyal, lived longer than they should have. Silas always said it was because we treated them like family instead of livestock. He believed that love could change the very nature of an animal, make it something more than what it was born to be. That sounds like superstition, not science. Maybe, but Misty out there is living proof that some things can't be explained by science alone. Ophelia reached across the table and took his hand. She was born the spring before the fire, sired by our prize stallion, Eclipse. The night everything burned, she was just 6 months old, barely weaned. I thought she died. With the rest of them, Cordell felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. But if she survived, how did she end up in Wyoming? How did she know to find me? Because she was looking for home, Ophelia said simply. Not this place, this house, this subdivision. Home is people, Cordell. Home is family. You carry the same blood as the man who raised her, the same scent, the same soul. She's been searching for 43 years, waiting for one of us to need her as much as she needed us. Through the window, they watched Misty lift her head and look directly at them, as if she knew she was being discussed. Despite her injured leg, she moved with grace and purpose, cropping grass that had never known the freedom of an open range, but somehow satisfied her ancient hunger. The night Marcus decided to leave for Wyoming, Ophelia continued, he came to see me one last time. He was broken, Cordell. That fire took more than just buildings and animals, it took his faith in the future. He said he was starting over where nobody knew about his failures, where he could build something small and safe and never risk losing everything again. He did that, Cordell said quietly. Built a good life, never got rich, but we never went hungry either. But he also never let himself love anything the way he'd loved this place. I know, because I saw him. He'd visit sometimes, early on, before you were born. He'd stand right here in what used to be the main pasture and watch the construction crews build houses where horses used to run, the hurt in his eyes. It was terrible to see. Cordell thought about his father's ranch in Wyoming, how it had always felt temporary somehow, like they were just passing through instead of putting down roots. Marcus had been a good father, a hard worker, a decent man, but there had always been a distance in him, a part that remained unreachable. He made me promise never to contact you, Ophelia said. Said he wanted you to make your own way without being haunted by what came before. I respected that, even though it broke my heart. But I never stopped hoping that someday, somehow, we'd find our way back to each other, and now we have. Because of her, Ophelia nodded toward Misty. She's been carrying our family's memory all these years, waiting for the right moment to bring us together. Some might call it coincidence, but I know better. Love like that doesn't die, Cordell. It just transforms into something stronger. Outside, Misty raised her head and whinnied softly, the sound carrying across the small yard like a benediction. For the first time in 43 years, Cordell Brightwater felt like he was truly home. 3 weeks later, Cordell stood in the basement of the local historical society, surrounded by boxes that smelled of dust and forgotten dreams. Ophelia sat nearby, directing him toward files and photographs that chronicled for generations of Brightwater horse breeding. The broken leg that had brought Misty to him was healing remarkably well. The local veterinarian had called it unprecedented for a horse her age, and she now spent her days in Ophelia's small backyard, seeming content to wait while they unraveled the mystery of her impossible longevity. "Here," Ophelia said, lifting a leather-bound journal from a cedar box. "Your great-great-grandfather's breeding records. He was meticulous about documenting bloodlines. But he wrote other things too, things the family never talked about openly." Cordell opened the journal carefully, its pages yellow with age. Silas Brightwater's handwriting was precise, elegant in the way of a man educated in an era when penmanship mattered. The early entries were straightforward breeding dates, full records, health notes, but as Cordell read deeper, the entries became more cryptic, more personal. "Listen to this," he said, reading aloud. "Eclipse's bloodline carries something beyond the natural. The mares bred to him produce foals with unusual intelligence, as if they understand human speech, more concerning or perhaps more wondrous several. Horses from his line have lived well beyond their expected years. Starlight, his grandmother, reached 37 before peacefully passing in her sleep. Thunder, his great-uncle, was reported to be 42 when he disappeared into the mountains, though neighboring ranchers claimed to have seen him running wild. For years after," Ophelia nodded slowly, "keep reading, it gets stranger. I have begun to suspect that our care and love for these animals has awakened something dormant in their nature," Cordell continued. "They respond not just to commands but to emotions, to thoughts unspoken. When my youngest daughter fell ill with scarlet fever, Thunder stood at her bedroom window for 3 days and nights, refusing food or water until her fever broke. The doctor called it coincidence. I know better. Your great-great-grandfather was a scientist before he was a rancher," Ophelia explained. "Studied animal husbandry at the agricultural college. Before coming out here to homestead, he approached everything systematically, kept detailed records of things other folks might have dismissed as fancy." Cordell turned more pages, finding sketches of horses alongside notes about their behavior. One drawing showed Eclipse himself a magnificent stallion with intelligent eyes, and what appeared to be the same intricate brand he'd seen on Misty's neck. "The brand is not merely identification," he read. "It serves as a seal, a bond between horse and family that transcends the physical realm. I designed it myself, incorporating symbols I found in my grandfather's papers markings he claimed came from the old country, from traditions older than America itself. Each horse marked with this seal becomes something more than animal, something between the wild and the divine." "Show me that," Ophelia said, leaning closer to examine the drawing. "Yes, that's exactly what Misty carries. And look here," she pointed to a notation in the margin. "The seal must be applied with intention and love, never force. The horse must choose to accept it, or it remains merely scar tissue with no power beyond the physical. You think Misty chose this? Chose to become whatever she is. I think love changes everything it touches," Ophelia said quietly. "And I think your great-great-grandfather understood something about the bond between humans and horses that we've forgotten in our rush to make everything scientific and explainable." Cordell continued reading, finding entries that detailed the night Misty was born. Eclipse's final foal arrived during the worst storm of winter. He read, "The mare, Luna, labored for 18 hours while wind and snow battered the barn. When the filly finally emerged, she bore markings unlike any in our bloodline, a white star centered perfectly between her eyes, as if marked by lightning itself." Eclipse approached the newborn with unusual reverence, touching his muzzle to hers in what I can only describe as a blessing. "I have named her Misty Morning, for she seemed to bring dawn even in the darkest hour." "He knew," Ophelia whispered. "Somehow, he knew she was special." The final entries in the journal were written in a shaky hand, clearly near the end of Silas's life. "I am old now, and my hands can barely hold this pen. But I must record what I have witnessed. The horses of Eclipse's line do not simply age and die as others do. When their time comes to leave this realm, they choose their moment, their place, their purpose. Some vanish into the wild to run free for decades beyond their natural span. Others remain, close to home, guardians of the family that raised them. And a few, the most beloved, the most bonded, seem to exist between worlds, appearing when they are most needed, carrying love across impossible distances and through impossible years." Cordell closed the journal, his hands trembling slightly. Outside, they could hear Misty moving around the small yard, her hooves creating a rhythm against the concrete that sounded almost like a heartbeat. "She's been waiting," he said finally, "all these years. She's been waiting for the right moment to bring us back together. And now she has," Ophelia said, tears glistening in her eyes. "The question is, what do we do with this gift we've been given?" Cordell looked at his aunt, this woman who was family, who shared his blood and his love for creatures that defied explanation, and felt a sense of purpose settling into his bones like deep roots, finally finding soil. "We honor it," he said simply. "We honor her, and the legacy she's carried, and the love that made it all possible." By late spring, the transformation was already visible from the road. What had once been Cordell's modest Wyoming ranch now buzzed with purposeful activity as trucks delivered lumber, fencing materials, and the specialized equipment needed for a horse sanctuary. He'd sold his cattle, liquidated his savings, and taken out a loan against the property, everything focused on creating something worthy of the legacy Misty had revealed to them. Ophelia had surprised everyone, including herself, by selling her house in the subdivision and moving to Wyoming to help establish what they were calling the Brightwater Horse Sanctuary at 79. She claimed she was too old for such adventures, but her eyes sparkled with vitality whenever she talked about the project. Misty had made the journey well, her leg completely healed, traveling in the custom trailer Cordell had purchased specifically for transporting elderly or special needs horses. "The veterinary college is sending a team next week," Ophelia announced, consulting the tablet computer her grandson had taught her to use. "They want to study Misty's longevity, try to understand what makes her different from other horses her age." Cordell looked up from the fence post he was setting, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You think that's wise, having scientists poking and prodding at her?" "I think knowledge is meant to be shared," she replied. "If Misty's bloodline carries secrets that could help other horses live longer, healthier lives, don't we have an obligation to explore that? But we'll do it on our terms, with respect for her dignity and comfort." Across the pasture, Misty grazed peacefully alongside the 3 other horses they'd already rescued: a blind Appaloosa named Courage, an arthritic thoroughbred called Wisdom, and a Mustang with only 3 legs they'd dubbed Hope. All were animals that other sanctuaries had deemed too expensive or difficult to care for. But Cordell and Ophelia had learned that sometimes the most broken beings carried the greatest capacity for healing others. "The applications are coming in faster than we can process them," Ophelia continued. "Horse owners from all over the country want to send us their animals that are too old or injured for traditional rescue operations, and we've got 17 volunteers signed up for training next month." "Good," Cordell said, tamping earth around the fence post. "We're going to need all the help we can get." The sanctuary was designed around principles Cordell had extrapolated from his great-great-grandfather's journal: horses grouped by compatibility rather than age or breed, with spaces for both solitude and companionship. Each animal would receive individualized care based on their specific needs, and none would be euthanized simply because they were old or required expensive treatment. "I got a call from that reporter in Denver," Ophelia said. "She wants to do a follow-up story about Misty and the sanctuary. I told her we'd consider it, but only if she agrees to focus on the rescue work rather than sensationalizing Misty's age." "Probably wise. The last thing we need is circus atmosphere around here." They'd been contacted by several media outlets after word spread about the miracle horse, who had reunited a fractured family. Cordell had granted one interview to a local newspaper, carefully downplaying the supernatural aspects of Misty's story while emphasizing the need for horse sanctuaries. But he was learning to be protective of their privacy, understanding that some mysteries were meant to be lived rather than explained. Dr. Ramirez, the equine veterinarian who'd been monitoring Misty's health, arrived as they were finishing the fence line. She climbed out of her truck with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to working with large animals, her gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "How's our miraculous patient today?" she asked, approaching Misty with the respectful confidence of someone who'd earned the horse's trust. "See for yourself," Cordell said. Watching as Misty lifted her head and nickered softly in greeting, Dr. Ramirez ran practiced hands over Misty's body, checking joints, listening to her heart, examining her eyes with a penlight. Remarkable, she murmured. Her muscle tone is better than horses half her claimed age. Her teeth show we're consistent with maybe 20 years, not 63. If I didn't know better, I'd say someone was playing an elaborate hoax. But you do know better, Ophelia said quietly. I know what I observe. Dr. Ramirez replied carefully. And what I observe defies everything I learned in veterinary school. Her blood work shows cellular activity that shouldn't be possible. Her bone density is extraordinary. Most significantly, her telomeres, the protective caps on chromosomes that shorten with age, appear to be regenerating rather than degrading. Which means what, exactly? Cordell asked. It means that somehow, at a cellular level, Misty is aging backwards, or not aging at all. It's unprecedented in veterinary medicine. Dr. Ramirez straightened, her expression thoughtful. The research team from the university wants to take tissue samples, maybe run some genetic tests. But I have to ask, do you really want to turn her into a laboratory subject? Cordell and Ophelia exchanged glances, the same concern reflected in both their faces. What would you recommend? Ophelia asked, honestly. I'd recommend letting her live her life in peace. Document her condition, monitor her health. But don't subject her to invasive procedures that might disrupt whatever miraculous balance she's achieved. Some mysteries are more valuable as inspiration than as scientific data. That evening, as sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Cordell sat on his porch watching Misty move among the other rescued horses. She seemed to have appointed herself their guardian, gently herding courage away from fence hazards, standing patient while hope leaned against her for balance, sharing her hay with wisdom when the old thoroughbred's arthritis made bending difficult. She's teaching them, Ophelia observed, settling into the chair beside him with 2 cups of coffee. Teaching them what? How to live with grace despite their limitations. How to find joy in simple moments. How to trust that they're safe now, that they'll be cared for until their last breath. Ophelia smiled, watching Misty nuzzle Courage's neck with infinite gentleness. She's showing them what it means to be loved unconditionally. And maybe, Cordell said slowly, that's her real gift, not the longevity, not the impossible health, but the capacity to heal other broken spirits just by being present with them. As if she'd heard him, Misty turned toward the porch and whinnied, softly, the sound carrying across the peaceful pasture like a blessing. In that moment, Cordell understood that they hadn't just built a sanctuary for horses, they'd created a place where miracles could unfold quietly daily. In the simple act of offering refuge to creatures that needed it most, the sanctuary was more than a business or a charity. It was a living testament to the power of love to transcend time, space, and the apparent limitations of the natural world. 1 year later, Cordell stood at the edge of what had once been his small cattle operation, and was now home to 23 rescued horses, each with their own story of survival and second chances. The Brightwater Horse Sanctuary had grown beyond his wildest expectations, supported by donations from across the country and staffed by volunteers who spoke of their work here in reverent tones, as if they understood they were part of something larger than a typical rescue operation. Misty moved through the main pasture like a queen among subjects, her coat gleaming with health that continued to baffle veterinarians who came to study what they'd begun calling the Brightwater phenomenon. 3 other horses at the sanctuary had begun showing similar signs of enhanced longevity and vitality, though none quite as dramatically as Misty herself. The documentary crew from National Geographic wants to come back for a follow-up segment, Ophelia announced, approaching with a tablet in one hand and a lead rope in the other. At 80, she moved with the confidence of someone who'd found her true calling later in life than expected. They're particularly interested in documenting the therapeutic effects our horses seem to have on the children from the special needs program. Cordell nodded, watching a group of young visitors from the local autism center as they brushed and talked softly to Courage, the blind Appaloosa who'd become the sanctuary's most popular therapy horse. As long as they understand this isn't a circus, these animals deserve dignity, "I made that very clear," Ophelia assured him. "They want to focus on the healing that happens here, not just the mystery of Misty's longevity." The healing was undeniable. Children who rarely spoke began chattering to the horses. Veterans with PTSD found peace in grooming and caring for animals who understood trauma without judgment. Elderly visitors from local nursing homes brightened visibly when they spent time in the pastures, their own pain seeming to diminish in the presence of creatures who'd learned to live fully. Despite their limitations, Dr. Ramirez called with the latest test results. Ophelia continued, "Misty's cellular regeneration is actually accelerating. She's not just maintaining her health, she's getting stronger." And the blood samples from Echo, Serenity, and Mountain Song are showing similar patterns. Echo, Serenity, and Mountain Song were 3 horses they'd rescued in the past 6 months, all elderly animals slated for euthanasia at other facilities. Within weeks of arriving at the sanctuary, each had begun showing remarkable improvements in health and vitality, as if Misty's presence was somehow contagious. "It's the bond," Cordell said, finally putting into words what he'd been observing for months. "Somehow, Misty's sharing whatever gift she carries, not through genetics or medicine, but through relationship. Your great-great-grandfather would say she's teaching them to accept love," Ophelia replied. "And that love, when it's pure enough and strong enough, can literally transform the physical world." They were interrupted by the arrival of a van from the university's veterinary research program. Dr. Chen, the lead researcher, climbed out with her usual armload of equipment, followed by 2 graduate students who still looked slightly awed. Every time they encountered Misty, "How's our miracle mare today?" Dr. Chen called, her enthusiasm undimmed by months of studying phenomena that challenged everything she thought she knew about equine biology. "See for yourself," Cordell replied, gesturing toward the pasture where Misty was demonstrating perfect health by engaging in what could only be described as play, rearing up on her hind legs, racing in circles, bucking with pure joy. "Incredible," Dr. Chen murmured, setting up her portable ultrasound equipment. "Her cardiovascular function is that of a horse in peak athletic condition. Her joints show no signs of wear. Her muscle development is actually increasing month by month." As they watched, a small group of children from the special needs program arrived for their weekly session. The transformation was immediate and profound. Children who'd entered the van withdrawn and anxious began smiling the moment they saw the horses. Misty approached the fence with gentle authority, allowing tiny hands to stroke her muzzle while she stood perfectly still, as if she understood the sacred trust placed in her. "She knows," Ophelia whispered. "She knows exactly what each person needs from her." One little girl, who according to her teachers had never spoken aloud, pressed her face against Misty's neck and began humming softly. The sound was barely audible, but it carried across the pasture like music, causing other horses to lift their heads and listen. "This is what I don't understand," Dr. Chen said, her scientific training warring with what she witnessed weekly at the sanctuary. "The physiological improvements in these animals should be impossible, but the psychological and emotional healing they facilitate in humans, that's beyond impossible. It's miraculous." "Maybe," Cordell said quietly, "the two aren't separate phenomena. Maybe healing the spirit is what allows the body to transcend its apparent limitations." That evening, after the researchers had packed their equipment and the visitors had departed, Cordell found himself alone in the pasture with Misty. The setting sun painted everything in golden light, and the air carried the peaceful sounds of horses settling for the night. "You did it, didn't you?" he said softly, running his hand along her neck. "You brought us all home. Not just me and Ophelia, but every broken soul who's found healing here." Misty turned to look at him with those dark, knowing eyes that had first captured his attention in the Wyoming snow. For a moment, he could have sworn she smiled not with her mouth, but with her entire being, radiating a contentment so profound it seemed to alter the very air around them. "Thank you," he whispered, understanding that some gifts were too large for adequate words. "Thank you for showing us that love really can conquer time, distance, and every limitation we thought was permanent." As if in response, Misty touched his shoulder gently with her muzzle, a gesture of acknowledgement and blessing that sealed the circle of healing. She'd drawn around them all. 5 years after that first encounter in the snow, Cordell Brightwater stood before a gathering of 300 people who had come to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the Brightwater Horse Sanctuary. The modest operation had grown into a nationally recognized center for equine-assisted therapy, scientific research, and what some visitors simply called miracles. Misty, now officially documented as 68 years old, but appearing to be in the prime of life, grazed peacefully in the main pasture alongside 47 other rescued horses. 12 of them now showed signs of the same enhanced longevity and regenerative health that had first made Misty famous. Though researchers had stopped trying to explain the phenomenon in purely scientific terms, when I found an injured horse in the snow 5 years ago, Cordell told the gathered crowd, "I thought I was rescuing her. I didn't understand that she was actually rescuing me, rescuing all of us." He gestured toward the audience, which included family members of children who'd found their voices here, veterans who'd found peace, elderly visitors who'd found reasons to keep living. Dr. Chen, now a permanent consultant to the sanctuary, had published papers that were revolutionizing the field of veterinary medicine. Her research suggested that the horses at Brightwater were demonstrating something science was only beginning to understand: the power of emotional and spiritual bonds to literally rewrite biological limitations. "The horses here don't just live longer," she'd written in her most recent publication. "They live more fully, with greater awareness, deeper connections, and a sense of purpose that transcends typical animal behavior. They appear to understand their role as healers, accepting that responsibility with grace and wisdom that humbles every human who encounters them." Ophelia, now 84,